The morning mist clung to the banks of the Rubicon River like a shroud of destiny. It was January 10th, 49 BCE, and Gaius Julius Caesar stood at the water's edge, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his horse. Behind him stretched the most battle-hardened legions Rome had ever seen, their bronze armor gleaming dully in the pale dawn light. The veterans of 8 years of Gallic warfare watched their commander with absolute devotion, unaware that this single moment would reshape the entire Roman world. Caesar's piercing eyes gazed across the shallow waters that marked the sacred boundary between Gaul and Italia. Roman law was clear and absolute. No general could bring armed forces across this river without Senate approval. To cross meant civil war. To turn back meant certain death at the hands of his political enemies in Rome. The die, as he would famously declare, was about to be cast. But how did this ambitious patrician from the suburb district of Rome come to stand at this crossroads of history? The answer lies in the blood-soaked forests of Gaul, where Caesar had spent nearly a decade forging himself into the greatest military commander of his age. Born into the prestigious Julian family in 100 BCE, Caesar's early life was marked by both privilege and peril. His family claimed descent from Venus herself, through the Trojan prince Aeneas, yet they had fallen from the heights of political power. Young Caesar witnessed the brutal civil wars between Marius and Sulla, learning firsthand that in Rome, political survival meant wielding both sword and stylus with equal skill. The turning point came in 60 BCE when Caesar formed the first triumvirate with Pompey the Great and Marcus Crassus. This secret alliance allowed him to secure the consulship and, more importantly, the governorship of Gaul. What his partners saw as a convenient exile, Caesar recognized as an opportunity to win the greatest prize of all, Gloria, the immortal glory that came only through conquest. The Gallic Wars began almost immediately. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe from modern-day Switzerland, were migrating westward, threatening Roman interests. Caesar's first major victory came at Bibracte in 58 BCE, where his legions demonstrated the disciplined brutality that would characterize his entire campaign. The Helvetii warriors, brave but undisciplined, shattered against the Roman shield wall like waves against a cliff. But Caesar's true genius lay not just in tactics, but in understanding his enemy. The Gauls were fierce warriors, their society built around honor and personal courage. They fought with long swords and tremendous individual skill, but they lacked the systematic organization that made Roman armies so deadly. Caesar spent months studying their customs, their languages, their tribal rivalries. He learned that Gaul was not one nation but dozens, each with ancient grudges and ambitions. The campaign against the Belgae in 57 BC showcased Caesar's strategic brilliance. These northern tribes were considered the fiercest warriors in Gaul, their very name striking fear into Roman hearts. Caesar divided his forces, using the terrain to his advantage. At the Battle of the Sabus River, his legions were caught seemingly unprepared while making camp. The Belgae warriors, screaming their war cries, charged down the hillside like a human avalanche. But Caesar had anticipated this moment. As the barbarians crashed into what they thought was a disorganized Roman camp, they found instead a carefully prepared killing ground. The legionaries, their shields locked in perfect formation, their gladi thrusting with mechanical precision, cut down the charging warriors in heaps. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and fought in the front ranks, his scarlet cloak making him a target for every enemy's spear, yet inspiring his men to feats of incredible courage. The conquest of Gaul was not merely a series of battles, it was a systematic campaign of psychological warfare. Caesar understood that the Gauls' greatest strength, their fierce independence, was also their greatest weakness. He played tribe against tribe, offering alliance to some while crushing others with merciless efficiency. His commentaries, written in his own hand, describe these campaigns with clinical detachment, yet they reveal the mind of a military genius at work. The siege of Gergovia in 52 BC demonstrated both Caesar's tactical brilliance and his willingness to take enormous risks. The fortress, perched on a seemingly impregnable hill, was defended by Vercingetorix, a young Gallic chieftain who had managed to unite the tribes against Rome. For the first time in his career, Caesar faced an enemy who understood Roman tactics and had the charisma to forge a unified resistance. The siege lasted months, with Caesar's engineers performing miracles of Roman engineering. They built massive siege works, including a double wall that stretched for miles around the fortress. The outer wall faced outward, defending against relief forces, while the inner wall trapped the defenders inside. Between these walls, Caesar's legions waited with the patience of professional soldiers, slowly starving their enemies into submission. Yet Vercingetorix proved a worthy opponent. The young Gallic leader had learned from previous defeats, avoiding open battle, and instead using guerrilla tactics that played to his people's strengths. He burned crops and destroyed supplies, turning the countryside into a wasteland that could not support Caesar's army. For the first time, Caesar faced the possibility of defeat in Gaul. The final confrontation came at Alasia, where Caesar's engineering skills reached their pinnacle. The Roman siege works were so extensive that they became a wonder of the ancient world. Faced with starvation and the screams of their families trapped within the fortress, the Gallic warriors made one last desperate assault. 3 armies converged on Caesar's position: the defenders of Alasia, a massive relief force, and the trapped civilians driven to desperation. Caesar's response was characteristic of his genius. He divided his forces, fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. His cavalry, led by Germanic mercenaries, swept around the Gallic relief force while his legions held the walls. At the crucial moment, Caesar himself led a charge that broke the Gallic line, his scarlet cloak visible to every Roman soldier as he carved through the enemy ranks. Vercingetorix, seeing his people's cause was lost, made a decision that would echo through history. In full armor and astride his finest horse, he rode out of Alasia alone. He circled Caesar's camp 3 times, then threw down his weapons and surrendered himself to spare his people further suffering. This act of nobility from a barbarian chieftain impressed even the Romans, though it did not save Vercingetorix from eventual execution in Rome. The Gallic wars had cost an estimated 1 million lives and enslaved another million. Yet they had also made Caesar the richest man in Rome and given him the loyalty of battle-tested legions. His soldiers had followed him through the darkest forests of Germania, across the treacherous waters of the English Channel, and through 8 years of continuous warfare. They called him imperator, not just commander, but conqueror. More importantly, Caesar had proven that Roman arms could triumph anywhere against any enemy. The conquest of Gaul doubled the size of the Roman world and brought unimaginable wealth flowing into Roman coffers. The gold of Gallic temples adorned Roman buildings, while Gallic slaves built Roman roads and worked Roman fields. Caesar's campaigns had demonstrated that the Roman Empire was not just a Mediterranean power, but a force that could reshape the world. Yet even as his triumphs mounted, Caesar knew that his greatest challenge lay not in the barbarian lands beyond the frontier, but in the marble halls of Rome itself. His old partner Pompey, jealous of Caesar's growing power and popularity, had turned against him. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's veteran legions and his bottomless ambition, demanded that he return to Rome as a private citizen, defenseless and vulnerable to his enemies. The political maneuvering that followed was as intricate as any military campaign. Caesar's enemies, led by Cato the Younger, passed a senatus consultum ultimum declaring him an enemy of the state. They ordered him to disband his armies and return to Rome immediately, knowing that without his legion's protection, Caesar would face trial and certain exile or death. Caesar's response was swift and decisive. He marched his legions to the Rubicon, the river that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. Roman law strictly forbade any general from crossing this boundary with armed forces. To do so was an act of war against the Roman state itself. As Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon that fateful January morning, he understood that he faced the most important decision of his life. Behind him lay 8 years of conquest, unparalleled military glory, and the devotion of the finest soldiers in the world. Ahead lay civil war, the destruction of the Roman Republic, and either absolute power or ignominious death. The crossing itself was anticlimactic. Caesar's horse stepped into the shallow water, followed by his bodyguard, then the first cohort of the famous 10th Legion. As the standards of Rome crossed the sacred boundary, Caesar reportedly uttered the words that would echo through history. Alia apta state, the die is cast. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. Pompey, caught unprepared by Caesar's speed and audacity, fled to Greece to gather his forces. Caesar pursued him relentlessly, his legions covering impossible distances with legendary endurance. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, the two greatest generals of their age met in battle. Caesar's veterans, fighting for their beloved commander, shattered Pompey's larger but less experienced army. Pompey's death on an Egyptian beach marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of Caesar's dictatorship. Yet even in victory, Caesar showed the clemency that had marked his character throughout the Gallic Wars. He pardoned his enemies, honored his opponents, and worked to heal the wounds of civil war. The Ides of March 44 BCE brought Caesar's story to its dramatic conclusion. As he lay bleeding on the floor of the Senate House, 23 wounds marking his body, Caesar might have reflected on the price of absolute power. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and become master of the Roman world. Yet in the end, the very senators he had shown mercy to struck him down with their daggers. Caesar's legacy, forged in the forests of Gaul and sealed at the Rubicon, would outlive the Roman Empire itself. His name became synonymous with imperial power, Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar, while his military reforms and conquests shaped the course of European history for millennia to come. The boy from the Suburra had indeed achieved immortal glory, though at a cost that would haunt Rome for generations. The great hall of the Palace of Poitiers buzzed with anticipation as Eleanor of Aquitaine prepared to defy the most powerful man in Christendom. It was Christmas Day 1170, and the Queen of England sat in judgment not just of vassals and merchants, but of the very nature of power itself. At 48 years old, Eleanor had already lived 3 lifetimes, as Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France, and now Queen of England. But on this winter day, she would take on her most dangerous role yet, rebel against her own husband, King Henry II. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across Eleanor's face as she listened to the assembled lords and ladies. Her court had become a sanctuary for troubadours and poets, a place where the rigid hierarchies of medieval society bent to the will of the most remarkable woman of her age. Yet beneath the elegant facade of courtly love and chivalric romance, Eleanor was plotting revolution. Born around 1122 in the sun-drenched lands of Aquitaine, Eleanor inherited more than just vast territories. She inherited a legacy of independence that would define her entire life. Her grandfather, William IX, had been one of the first troubadours, a poet-duke who scandalized Europe with his verses celebrating earthly love over heavenly devotion. Her father, William X, had continued this tradition of defying convention, and Eleanor proved to be their most worthy successor. When William X died suddenly in 1137, 15-year-old Eleanor became the most eligible heiress in Europe. Her duchy of Aquitaine was larger and richer than the royal domain of France itself, stretching from the Loire Valley to the Pyrenees. The young duchess controlled the wine trade, the pilgrim routes to Santiago de Compostela, and the troubadour culture that was revolutionizing European literature and music. King Louis VI of France, recognizing the strategic importance of Aquitaine, immediately arranged Eleanor's marriage to his son, the future Louis VII. The wedding took place in the summer of 1137, just days after Louis VI's death, making Eleanor Queen of France before her 16th birthday. Yet from the beginning, The marriage was a clash of incompatible worldviews. Louis VII was a deeply pious man, thin and pale, who preferred the company of monks to the glittering court life that Eleanor found essential. He wore a hair shirt beneath his royal robes and spent hours in prayer, while Eleanor surrounded herself with musicians, poets, and scholars. Their court became a battleground between the austere religiosity of northern France and the sophisticated culture of the south. The first major crisis came in 1141 when Louis's men burned the church of Vitry-le-François during a campaign against the Count of Champagne. Over 1,000 people died in the flames, including women and children who had sought sanctuary. Eleanor watched in horror as her husband's face grew gaunt with guilt and religious obsession. This tragedy marked the beginning of their relationship's slow deterioration. Eleanor's response was characteristically bold. She convinced Louis to take the cross and join the Second Crusade, seeing it as an opportunity to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the French court and perhaps find absolution for the massacre at Vitry. But more importantly, she insisted on accompanying him to the Holy Land, bringing with her a contingent of Aquitanian knights and a household of noble ladies. The crusade was a disaster from the beginning. Eleanor's presence scandalized the more conservative crusaders, who whispered that she and her ladies were more interested in fashion than fighting. These rumors intensified when the crusading army reached Antioch in 1148, where Eleanor was reunited with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the charismatic prince of Antioch. Raymond was everything that Louis was not: handsome, sophisticated, and politically astute. He had transformed Antioch into a cosmopolitan center of learning and culture, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. Eleanor found herself intellectually and emotionally drawn to this glittering court, while Louis grew increasingly suspicious of his wife's relationship with her uncle. The crisis came when Raymond proposed a strategic alliance that would have strengthened the Crusader states but required the French army to remain in Antioch. Eleanor supported the plan enthusiastically, but Louis, influenced by his advisors and perhaps by jealousy, rejected it outright. When Eleanor threatened to remain in Antioch without him, Louis took desperate action. In the dead of night, he ordered his guards to seize Eleanor and carry her away by force. The humiliation of being dragged from Antioch like a prisoner marked the end of Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII. Though they continued to Jerusalem and completed their crusading vows, the royal couple returned to France as strangers. Eleanor's experiences in the sophisticated courts of Constantinople and Antioch had opened her eyes to possibilities far beyond the narrow confines of Capetian France. The annulment of their marriage in 1152 was presented as a case of consanguinity. They were distantly related, but everyone understood the real reason. In 15 years of marriage, Eleanor had produced only 2 daughters, and Louis needed a son to secure his dynasty. More importantly, Eleanor had proven uncontrollable, her independence and intelligence threatening the established order of medieval marriage. Within months of her annulment, Eleanor made a decision that shocked Europe. She married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who was 11 years her junior and already recognized as the most promising warrior of his generation. The marriage was a love match. It was also a calculated political alliance that would reshape the map of Europe. When Henry became King of England in 1154, Eleanor found herself Queen of England and mistress of an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Being given empire, as historians would later call it, was the most powerful political entity in Western Europe, and Eleanor was its co-ruler in all but name. The early years of her marriage to Henry were marked by passion and partnership. Eleanor accompanied Henry on his campaigns, advised him on policy, and bore him 8 children in 13 years. She was pregnant or nursing almost constantly, yet she never abandoned her role as Duchess of Aquitaine or her interest in politics and culture. Eleanor's court became the center of a cultural revolution. She patronized troubadours and poets, encouraging the development of courtly love literature that would influence European culture for centuries. The concept of romantic love, the idea that noble passion could ennoble both lover and beloved, found its fullest expression in Eleanor's circle. Yet beneath the surface of this golden age, tensions were building. Henry's character contained a streak of Angevin fury that could explode without warning. He was a man of enormous energy and ambition, but he was also possessive and controlling. As Eleanor entered her 40s, she began to chafe against her husband's increasingly autocratic rule. The breaking point came in 1170 when Henry ordered the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Eleanor had watched her husband's conflict with his former friend with growing alarm, recognizing that Henry's rage was consuming his judgment. When news of Becket's death reached her court at Poitiers, Eleanor understood that her husband had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The rebellion that followed was Eleanor's masterpiece of political strategy. She convinced her three eldest sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, to rise against their father. This was not merely a family quarrel but a carefully orchestrated challenge to Henry's authority that drew support from across Europe. Eleanor's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. She understood that Henry's greatest strength, his vast territories, was also his greatest weakness. He could not be everywhere at once, and his son's rebellion would force him to fight on multiple fronts. She arranged for Louis VII of France to support her sons, while she herself sought refuge at the court of her eldest son in Normandy. The rebellion began in 1173 when Henry the young king fled to Paris, followed quickly by Richard and Geoffrey. Eleanor's role in orchestrating this revolt was clear to everyone, including Henry himself. When he learned that his wife had been secretly negotiating with his enemies, his fury knew no bounds. He ordered her arrest, but Eleanor had already fled Poitiers, disguised as a man and riding hard for the safety of her son's court. She almost made it. Eleanor's capture near Laux in 1173 marked the beginning of 16 years of captivity. Henry's soldiers found her dressed as a knight, her long hair bound up beneath a helmet, her feminine figure disguised by chain mail. Even in defeat, Eleanor maintained her dignity, refusing to show fear or ask for mercy. Her imprisonment was comfortable by medieval standards. She was kept in various castles and palaces, attended by servants and allowed to receive visitors. But it was imprisonment nonetheless, a constant reminder of her husband's power and her own vulnerability. Henry used her captivity as a weapon against their sons, threatening to harm her if they continued their rebellion. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor remained a formidable political force. Her supporters throughout Aquitaine and Poitou refused to accept Henry's authority, maintaining that their duchess was being held against her will. The rebellion continued sporadically for years, with Eleanor's sons launching new campaigns whenever they felt strong enough to challenge their father. The death of Henry the young king in 1183 marked a turning point in the family's fortunes. The young man's death from dysentery during a campaign against his brother Richard devastated Eleanor, who had seen him as her political heir. Henry, too, grief-stricken by his son's death, began to show signs of the physical and mental exhaustion that would eventually kill him. Eleanor's liberation came in 1189 when Henry II died at Chinon, defeated by his son Richard and his ally Philip Augustus of France. Richard's first act as king was to order his mother's release from captivity. Eleanor, now 67 years old, emerged from 16 years of imprisonment with her intelligence and determination intact. The final phase of Eleanor's life was perhaps her most remarkable. As Queen Mother, she became Richard's chief advisor and regent, ruling England in his absence during the Third Crusade. When Richard was captured on his return journey, Eleanor personally negotiated his ransom, traveling across Europe to raise the enormous sum required for his release. Eleanor's energy in her 70s was extraordinary. She crossed the Pyrenees to fetch her granddaughter Blanche from the court of Castile, arranging her marriage to Louis VIII of France in a diplomatic masterstroke that would eventually unite the crowns. of France and England. She quelled rebellions in Aquitaine with a combination of diplomacy and force, proving that her political skills had not dimmed with age. The Queen Mother's final great crisis came in 1204 when her son John lost Normandy to Philip Augustus. Eleanor, now over 80, retreated to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she had long planned to spend her final years. She died on April 1, 1204, surrounded by the nuns who had cared for her and the tomb effigies of her husband and son Richard that she had commissioned. Eleanor's legacy extends far beyond her political achievements. She was the mother of two kings of England, the patron of troubadours who created the literature of courtly love, and the woman who demonstrated that intelligence and determination could triumph over the constraints of medieval society. Her rebellion against Henry II showed that even queens could challenge the absolute power of kings, inspiring generations of strong women to follow her example. In the end, Eleanor of Aquitaine achieved something that few medieval rulers, male or female, could claim. She lived life entirely on her own terms. From the courts of France and England to the battlefields of the Holy Land, from the heights of power to the depths of captivity, she remained uncompromisingly herself. The troubadours sang of impossible love and unattainable ideals, but Eleanor embodied something far more powerful, the reality of a woman who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. The gas lamps flickered in the war room of the White House as Abraham Lincoln bent over the latest dispatches from the front. It was July 1863, and the reports made for grim reading. General Meade's Army of the Potomac had won a bloody victory at Gettysburg, but at a cost that made Lincoln's heart heavy with grief. 50,000 American boys, sons of farmers and shopkeepers, immigrants and natives, lay dead or wounded on a Pennsylvania battlefield. The rebellion that had begun with such certainty on both sides had become a grinding war of attrition that threatened to consume the nation itself. Lincoln's tall frame was bent with exhaustion as he read the casualty reports. At 54, the president looked far older than his years. His face, always gaunt, had become positively skeletal, his deep-set eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and the weight of decisions that would echo through eternity. The prairie lawyer who had once split rails and told jokes at country stores now held the fate of the Union in his withered hands. But Lincoln's greatest test was yet to come. In his desk drawer lay a document that would transform the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation awaited his signature, but Lincoln knew that freeing the slaves would fundamentally alter the character of the conflict. Border states might join the Confederacy, European powers might intervene, and the Democratic Party would use emancipation as a weapon against him in the coming election. The journey to this moment had been long and tortuous, marked by political calculation and moral awakening in equal measure. Lincoln's evolution on the question of slavery reflected the broader struggle of a nation grappling with its founding contradictions. The man who would become known as the Great Emancipator had once been willing to accept slavery's continued existence if it meant preserving the Union. Born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, Abraham Lincoln entered a world where slavery was an accepted fact of American life. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a struggling farmer who moved the family to Indiana when Abraham was 7, partly to escape the economic competition from slave labor. Young Abraham grew up in a household where slavery was disapproved of on economic rather than moral grounds. The formative experience of Lincoln's youth was not poverty, though his family was poor, but rather the frontier democracy that surrounded him. In Indiana and later Illinois, Lincoln witnessed a society where merit mattered more than birth, where a man could rise through education and hard work. This meritocratic ideal would later inform his opposition to slavery as a system that denied opportunity to an entire race. Lincoln's first direct encounter with slavery came during a flatboat trip to New Orleans in 1828. The 19-year-old frontier youth witnessed the slave markets of the South. where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. The sight of families being separated and children sold away from their parents made a profound impression on the young man. Years later, he would describe slavery as the one thing that ever made me mad. Yet Lincoln's path to political prominence was marked by pragmatism rather than abolitionist fervor. As a young lawyer and politician in Illinois, he carefully navigated the complex politics of slavery in a state where Southern sympathies ran strong. His early political positions were moderate, opposing the expansion of slavery while accepting its existence where it already flourished. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 marked Lincoln's return to national politics after a period of relative obscurity. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's old political rival, had championed the act as a solution to the slavery question through popular sovereignty, letting territorial residents decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. Lincoln saw this as a betrayal of the Missouri Compromise and a dangerous expansion of slavery's reach. In a series of speeches across Illinois, Lincoln articulated a position that would define his political career. Slavery was morally wrong, but the Constitution protected it where it existed. However, the federal government had both the right and the duty to prevent slavery's expansion into new territories. This position appealed to free-soil Democrats and anti-slavery Whigs while avoiding the extremism of abolitionist demands for immediate emancipation. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 elevated this obscure prairie warrior to national prominence. In 7 face-to-face encounters, Lincoln and Douglas grappled with the fundamental questions facing the nation. Douglas, the little giant, defended popular sovereignty and white supremacy with sophisticated arguments that appealed to racial prejudices. Lincoln, tall and awkward but possessed of remarkable eloquence, argued that slavery was a moral wrong that made a mockery of American ideals. At Freeport, Lincoln posed the question that would haunt Douglas's presidential ambitions. Could residents of a territory exclude slavery despite the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision? Douglas's answer, that territorial residents could effectively exclude slavery by refusing to pass protective legislation, satisfied neither Northern abolitionists nor Southern fire eaters. Lincoln had forced his opponent into a position that would split the Democratic Party and open the door to Republican victory in 1860. The Republican nomination that year was by no means certain for Lincoln. William Seward of New York was the favorite, with a long record of anti-slavery activism. But Lincoln's moderate positions and his ability to carry the crucial swing states of the Midwest made him the compromise candidate. The rail splitter from Illinois was nominated on the 3rd ballot, largely because he had made fewer enemies than his rivals. Lincoln's election triggered the secession crisis that his supporters had hoped to avoid. South Carolina left the Union 6 weeks after the election, followed by 6 other Deep South states. By the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, the Confederate States of America had been formed, and Jefferson Davis had been inaugurated as its president. The new president's inaugural address was a masterpiece of conciliation and firmness. Lincoln assured the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, but he also made clear that secession was illegal and that he would hold, occupy, and possess federal property in the seceded states. The crisis came at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where Confederate forces demanded the surrender of the federal garrison. Lincoln's handling of the Fort Sumter crisis revealed his political genius. He could not allow the fort to be surrendered without appearing weak, but he also could not afford to fire the first shot and be blamed for starting a war. His solution was to resupply the fort with provisions only, forcing the Confederates to choose between allowing federal reinforcement or opening fire on the flag. When Confederate batteries bombarded Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, Lincoln had successfully maneuvered his enemies into starting the war. The early months of the conflict were marked by Union disasters and Lincoln's growing frustration with his generals. The defeat at Bull Run in July 1861 shattered Northern illusions about a quick victory, while General McClellan's Peninsula Campaign the following year demonstrated the Army of the Potomac's organizational skills but not its fighting ability. Lincoln found himself learning military strategy while managing a fractious cabinet and a hostile Congress. The pressure to act against slavery intensified as the war dragged on. Radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner demanded immediate emancipation, while conservative Democrats threatened to withdraw support for the war if Lincoln moved against slavery. The president found himself caught between these competing pressures, searching for a policy that would help win the war without destroying his political coalition. Lincoln's evolving position on slavery reflected both moral conviction and military necessity. The Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862 authorized the seizure of enemy property, including slaves, but stopped short of general emancipation. The president's correspondence during this period reveals his growing belief that slavery must be addressed to win the war and preserve the Union. The decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation was ultimately driven by military considerations. By the summer of 1862, it had become clear that the war would be long and costly, requiring the mobilization of all available resources. Freeing the slaves would deprive the Confederacy of labor while potentially adding manpower to Union forces. It would also transform the conflict from a war to preserve the Union into a war for human freedom, making European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy politically impossible. Lincoln's cabinet meeting on July 22, 1862, was one of the most consequential in American history. The president read his draft proclamation to the assembled secretaries, many of whom were shocked by its scope. Secretary of State Seward argued that the proclamation should be delayed until after a Union victory, lest it appear to be the last measure of an exhausted government. Lincoln accepted this advice, and the proclamation was shelved until after the Battle of Antietam in September. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued on September 22, 1862, gave the Confederate States 100 days to return to the Union or face the freeing of their slaves. The document was carefully crafted to minimize political damage while maximizing military advantage. It applied only to states in rebellion, exempting the border states and areas under Union control. Critics pointed out that it freed slaves only where Lincoln had no power to enforce it, but the president understood that this was a war measure designed to weaken the enemy. The final Emancipation Proclamation, signed on January 1, 1863, was a more radical document than its preliminary version. It not only freed slaves in rebellious areas but also authorized the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army. This provision would prove crucial to Union victory, as nearly 200,000 African American men would serve in Union forces by the war's end. Lincoln's personal involvement in the recruitment and training of black soldiers revealed his deepening commitment to racial equality. He met with Frederick Douglass and other black leaders, promising equal pay and treatment for black soldiers. When Confederate forces threatened to execute captured black soldiers as insurrectionists, Lincoln threatened retaliation, declaring that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. The political cost of emancipation was enormous. Democratic gains in the 1862 midterm elections reflected Northern unease with the war's expanded aims. Lincoln faced criticism from both sides, abolitionists who thought he moved too slowly, and conservatives who thought he moved too fast. The president's response was characteristic. He would rather be right than popular, and he believed that history would vindicate his actions. The Gettysburg Address, delivered on November 19, 1863, crystallized Lincoln's vision of the war's meaning. In just 272 words, the president redefined the conflict as a test of whether democratic government could survive. The speech's famous conclusion, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, linked the preservation of the Union to the broader cause of human freedom. Lincoln's re-election in 1864 was by no means certain. The war had dragged on for 3 years with enormous casualties, and no clear end in sight. The Democratic nominee, General George McClellan, ran on a platform of negotiated peace that would have effectively recognized Confederate independence. Lincoln's own party was divided, with radical Republicans threatening to nominate a different candidate. The president's salvation came from the battlefield. General Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864 provided the military victory that Lincoln desperately needed. The fall of the Confederacy's second-largest city demonstrated that the Union was winning the war, not merely surviving it. Lincoln's re-election that November was a mandate for his policies, including emancipation. The war's final months saw Lincoln at his most magnanimous. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his assassination, called for malice toward none, charity for all, and the work of reconstruction. The president, who had prosecuted the war with determined ruthlessness, now sought to heal the nation's wounds through forgiveness and reconciliation. The assassination on April 14, 1865, transformed Lincoln from a controversial wartime leader into a martyred saint. John Wilkes Booth's bullet ended the life of the man who had preserved the Union and freed the slaves, but it also ensured Lincoln's place in the pantheon of American heroes. The great emancipator had paid the ultimate price for his principles, becoming himself a casualty of the war he had fought to preserve human freedom. Lincoln's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He was the great emancipator who freed 4 million slaves, but he was also a political pragmatist who moved cautiously on civil rights. He was the great unifier who preserved the nation, but he was also the war leader who presided over the bloodiest conflict in American history. Most importantly, he was the great defender of democracy who proved that government of the people could survive its greatest test. The rail splitter from Illinois had become something far greater than his humble origins suggested. Through moral courage and political skill, Abraham Lincoln had transformed himself from a prairie lawyer into the savior of the Union. His example continues to inspire leaders around the world who face the choice between what is popular and what is right. In the end, Lincoln's greatest victory was not on any battlefield, but in the realm of human conscience, where he proved that a nation conceived in liberty could indeed extend that liberty to all its people. As we reach the end of our journey through these pivotal moments in Western history, we can see how the threads of individual ambition, moral courage, and political genius weave together to create the tapestry of our shared past. Julius Caesar, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Abraham Lincoln, 3 figures separated by centuries and circumstances, yet united by their willingness to challenge the established order and reshape the world around them. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon demonstrated that individual ambition could transform the entire Roman world. His conquest of Gaul and subsequent civil war showed how military genius and political calculation could expand the boundaries of civilization itself. Yet Caesar's assassination also revealed the price of absolute power and the eternal tension between personal ambition and republican virtue. Eleanor of Aquitaine proved that even in the rigid hierarchies of medieval society, intelligence and determination could triumph over convention. Her rebellion against Henry II and her patronage of troubadour culture showed how a single remarkable individual could challenge both political authority and social norms. Eleanor's life demonstrated that the medieval world was far more complex and dynamic than stereotypes suggest, with powerful women playing crucial roles in shaping European civilization. Abraham Lincoln's evolution from prairie lawyer to great emancipator illustrates how moral conviction and political skill could transform not just a nation, but the very meaning of freedom itself. His leadership during the Civil War proved that democratic government could survive its greatest test. while his Emancipation Proclamation showed that principles of human equality could overcome even the deepest social divisions. These three figures remind us that history is not merely a series of abstract forces and inevitable trends, but the result of individual choices made by flesh and blood human beings. Caesar could have remained in Gaul, Eleanor could have accepted the constraints of queenship, and Lincoln could have avoided the slavery issue. Instead, each chose the path of greatest risk and greatest potential reward, changing the course of human history in the process. Their stories also reveal the interconnected nature of Western civilization. Caesar's conquests brought Celtic and Germanic peoples into the Roman world, creating the cultural synthesis that would define medieval Europe. Eleanor's court culture influenced the development of Romantic literature and chivalric ideals that spread across the continent. Lincoln's vision of democratic equality inspired liberation movements around the world, from the revolutions of 1848 to the civil rights struggles of the 20th century. What would you have done in their place? Could you have led legions across the Rubicon, knowing that victory meant civil war and defeat meant death? Would you have had the courage to defy the most powerful king in Europe, even at the cost of 16 years in captivity? Could you have signed a document freeing 4 million slaves, knowing it might cost you the election, and split your party? These questions aren't merely historical curiosities. They're challenges that face every generation. The same forces that drove Caesar, Eleanor, and Lincoln, ambition, independence, and moral conviction, continue to shape our world today. Their examples remind us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they're willing to risk everything for their principles. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, we can draw inspiration from these towering figures of the past. They show us that history is not predetermined, that individuals can make a difference, and that the courage to stand up for what's right can literally change the world. If you enjoyed this journey through the lives of these remarkable historical figures, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more immersive historical content. Which of these three figures inspired you the most? Caesar the Conqueror, Eleanor the Rebel Queen, or Lincoln the Great Emancipator? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from our viewers about which historical personalities resonate most strongly with them. And remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how we got to where we are today and where we might go tomorrow. These stories of ambition, courage, and transformation remind us that each of us has the power to write our own chapter in the ongoing story of human civilization. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey through Western history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering the amazing stories that connect us all to our shared human heritage.